Marcus Webb came home at 2 in the morning smelling like fryer grease and floor cleaner, and he stood in his own doorway for a full 10 seconds before he could make himself walk inside. 16 hours. 2 jobs stitched together into one long gray shift, and somewhere in the middle of it, at exactly 7:15, his daughter had walked out onto a stage in a purple leotard and danced for the very first time, and he had not been there to see it. If you have ever had to choose between a paycheck and a moment you can't get back, you already know the specific ache that was sitting in his chest right then. Stay with this one until the end, because what he found waiting for him on his pillow that night is the kind of thing that stops you cold, no matter how tired you are. 6 weeks earlier, none of this had a name yet. It was just Tuesdays and Thursdays and the slow math of rent versus hours, done at the kitchen table after his daughter went to sleep. Her name was Lily. She was 7, missing one front tooth, and she had signed up for the beginner ballet class at the community center back in September, back when Marcus still had a full-time schedule at the auto shop and a little breathing room. That breathing room had disappeared in October when the shop cut his hours to make room for 2 newer mechanics who worked cheaper. Marcus didn't argue about it. He never argued about things like that. He just picked up a second job at a diner 3 exits down the highway, because arguing didn't pay the light bill, and a second job did. He worked with his hands for a living, and he was good at it. The kind of good that doesn't announce itself. He could hear a bad wheel bearing from across a parking lot. He could diagnose an electrical short before the customer finished describing the symptom. None of that mattered much at 2 in the morning with a mop in his hand instead of a torque wrench. But it was who he was, underneath the exhaustion. And it didn't go anywhere just because the job did. Lily's recital had been scheduled for a Thursday evening, 7:15, at the community center auditorium. Marcus had known about it for 5 weeks. He had it written on the calendar in red marker. The only thing on that whole month written in red. 3 days before the recital, his manager at the diner, a man named Roy Castellano, posted the new schedule on the board by the walk-in cooler, and Marcus's name was on it for a double that started at 10 in the morning and didn't end until 2 the next morning. Thursday, the same Thursday. Marcus went to Roy's office, which was really just a storage room with a desk crammed into it, and asked, quietly, if there was any way to swap the shift. Roy didn't even look up from his phone. He said the schedule was final, that 2 people had already called out that week, and that if Marcus wanted fewer hours, he could go find them somewhere else. Marcus stood there a moment. He was not a man who raised his voice, not because he lacked the feeling underneath it, but because he had learned a long time ago that raising your voice rarely changed a schedule and often cost you the job entirely. He asked if he could at least leave for 1 hour, from 7 to 8, and come back. Roy said no. He said the dinner rush didn't care about dance recitals. He said it exactly like that. Dance recitals, with a little curl in his voice that made the words sound smaller than they were. Marcus took the shift. He didn't have a choice that he could see. And he was not a man who complained about the choices that were actually not choices at all. Only math wearing a different coat. He went home that night and told Lily, as gently as he could, that he might not make it to the recital, but that he would try everything he could to be there. Lily had looked up at him with the specific patience of a child who has already learned, at 7 years old, that grown-up jobs sometimes eat grown-up promises. She said it was okay. She said Miss Renata, her dance teacher, was going to record it on her tablet anyway. It was not okay, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so. For the next 3 days, Marcus worked his shop, hours, then went straight to the diner, and he thought about that red marker on the calendar more than he thought about anything else. He kept doing the math anyway, turning the shift over in his mind, the way you'd turn over an engine problem, looking for an angle nobody had noticed yet. On Wednesday, he asked one of the line cooks, a quiet kid named Danny, who was saving up for community college, if he'd be willing to cover the 7 to 8 slot in exchange for Marcus picking up Danny's Sunday morning shift, which nobody wanted anyway. Danny said yes, immediately, glad to trade an ugly slot for an even ugly slot he actually preferred. Marcus went back to Roy with the arrangement already built, already solved, needing only a signature of approval. It was the kind of clean, low-cost solution any manager should have been relieved to accept. Roy said no again. He said he didn't want employees rearranging his schedule behind his back, that if he let one person swap shifts, everyone would think they could, and that the answer had already been given and didn't need revisiting. Marcus did not raise his voice. He asked once more plainly if there was any way at all to get 1 hour off on Thursday. Roy told him if he walked out for even 10 minutes on a Thursday dinner shift, he shouldn't bother coming back Friday. Marcus nodded. He picked up his rag, went back to the floor, and finished his shift. He did not slam a door. He did not knock over a chair. He simply filed the information the way he filed everything, as a fact to be worked around rather than a wound to be nursed. And he went home to a daughter who was already asleep, her recital costume hanging on the closet door like a purple flag he could see from the hallway every time he passed. Thursday came, and Marcus worked the double exactly as scheduled because a fired father is worse for a daughter than an absent one for a single night, and he understood that math even while it was tearing something loose inside his chest. He worked the auto shop from 7 to 3, then went straight to the diner and worked until 2 in the morning, exactly as Roy had demanded, exactly as the math required. At 7:15 that evening, while he was clearing a table of dishes for a family of 4 who had left a decent tip, his daughter walked onto a stage 40 minutes away and performed her very first dance recital without him in the audience. He found out later that she scanned the crowd twice before the music started, looking for him in the 3rd row, where he'd promised he'd be sitting. He was not there. He was wiping ketchup off a table and refilling a coffee pot, and there was no way to be in 2 places when the 2 places were 40 minutes and a locked schedule apart. Marcus's co-worker at the diner, a waitress named Connie, who had 2 kids of her own and understood exactly what Thursday meant without needing it explained to her, covered his tables for 11 minutes so he could step into the walk-in cooler and put himself back together before returning to the floor. She never told Roy. She didn't owe Roy that kind of loyalty, not after watching him do this to Marcus for 6 weeks running. The shift ended at 2 in the morning, and Marcus drove home on empty roads, with his hands aching from carrying trays, and his mind circling the same 4 minutes over and over. The 4 minutes it would have taken him to watch his daughter's first dance. The 4 minutes Roy Castellano had decided were not worth a schedule adjustment. He parked in the driveway of the small rented house he'd kept clean and orderly on a budget that never had room for anything extra. The kind of home where every dish had a place and every bill was paid on time, even when it meant nothing was paid early. He let himself in quietly, careful not to wake the babysitter, an older neighbor named Mrs. Alvarez, who was asleep on the couch with the television still murmuring low. He paid her, walked her out, locked the door behind her, and stood in his living room for a moment in the dark, listening to the particular silence of a house where a child is sleeping and a parent has failed at something that mattered. He went to check on Lily the way he did every night, regardless of the hour, because that ritual was the one thing in his life the diner and the shop and Roy Castellano couldn't touch. Her door was cracked open, the way she liked it. She was asleep, one arm flung over her stuffed rabbit, her dance recital program still folded on the nightstand next to a half-empty glass of water. Marcus stood in the doorway a long moment, the way he had stood in his own front doorway earlier that same night, gathering himself before stepping inside. He didn't wake her. He only wanted to see her breathing, to confirm the one fact that mattered more than any shift or any schedule, which was that she was safe, and she was home, and she was in some fundamental way that Roy Castellano would never understand, still his to protect, even when he'd missed the thing that mattered to her most. He kissed her forehead so lightly she didn't stir, and he went to his own room to collapse into a few hours of sleep before the whole cycle started again in the morning. That was when he saw it. There was a sheet of construction paper laid carefully in the center of his pillow, positioned exactly where his head would land, which meant Lily had climbed onto his bed at some point that evening and placed it there herself, on purpose, knowing he wouldn't see it until he came home. The drawing was done in crayon, the way all of Lily's drawings were done, with the particular seriousness that 7-year-olds bring to art when they mean something by it. It showed 2 stick figures holding hands in front of a stage. One figure was small, in a purple triangle dress. The other was taller, wearing what was unmistakably meant to be a diner apron, colored in with careful brown crayon strokes that had clearly taken real effort and real patience to get right. Above the two figures, in uneven block letters that leaned progressively to the right as the sentence went on, Lily had written 4 lines. The first line said, "I danced my best because you work so hard for me." The second line said, "Miss Renata recorded it and I will show you tomorrow." The third line said, "I am not sad because I know you love me even when you're not there." And the fourth line, smaller than the rest, squeezed into the remaining space at the bottom of the page, said, "You are still my favorite person in the whole world." Marcus read it once, standing at the foot of his own bed, still in his work clothes, and it didn't fully land. He read it a second time, sitting down slowly on the edge of the mattress, and something in his chest began to loosen, in a way that felt less like relief and more like a wall giving way. He read it a third time, and that was when his legs stopped being willing to hold him up in a normal, upright, functioning way, and he slid down off the bed onto the floor of his bedroom, still holding the piece of construction paper in both hands like it might otherwise blow away. He sat there on the floor of his rented house at 2 in the morning, 16 hours into a day that had cost him something he could never buy back, and he cried the way men like Marcus rarely allow themselves to cry, which is to say quietly, without performance, without an audience. Just his shoulders moving and his breath catching, and the drawing held carefully enough that his tears didn't smear the crayon. It wasn't only grief. That would have been simple, and this wasn't simple. It was the specific, complicated ache of being loved by someone who had every reason to resent him, and instead had climbed onto his bed with a box of crayons to make sure he didn't come home to silence and guilt, but to proof. Proof that she'd understood something about him that Roy Castellano, in 6 weeks of scheduling him like a line item, had never once bothered to understand. That he was trying. That the trying counted for something, even on the nights when it didn't look like enough. He sat on that floor for a long time. Long enough that his legs went stiff beneath him and the light outside his window shifted from black toward the deep blue of early morning. He didn't move the drawing from his hands the entire time. Eventually he stood, propped the drawing carefully against the lamp on his nightstand where he'd see it first thing, and lay down on top of the covers, still in his work clothes, too tired and too wrung out to do anything more than close his eyes. He didn't sleep well. He kept opening his eyes to check that the drawing was still there, the way you check a door is locked even after you've already locked it. In the morning, Lily came into his room. Before her alarm even went off for school, climbing onto the bed the same way she must have climbed onto it the night before, and she asked him, with the bluntness only children have, if he saw what she left him. Marcus told her. He saw it. He told her it was the best thing anyone had ever given him. Lily said Miss Renata had the whole recital on video, and that she'd figured out how to send it to his phone through the group chat the studio used for parents, and that he could watch her dance anytime he wanted, even 100 times, even now. Marcus asked her to show him. They sat together on his bed, her small shoulder pressed against his side, and he watched his daughter dance for the first time on a screen 4 inches wide, 6 hours after it had actually happened. And it was not the same as being there. And it was also, somehow, enough because she was next to him narrating every step, telling him what Miss Renata had said about her pointed toes, telling him the part where she almost forgot the turn but remembered just in time. He watched it twice through before he had to leave for the shop. Before he left, he propped his phone against the coffee maker and watched a third time while he made her breakfast, because some mornings you find a way to be present in the only form that's left available to you. He did not go back to the diner and quit that day, though the thought crossed his mind more than once over the following week. He needed the second income too badly, and Roy Castellano, for all his smallness, hadn't technically done anything that would hold up as an actionable wrong. He'd simply been a man who valued a dinner rush over a father's presence at his daughter's first recital, and there was no form to file for that. No manager above Roy who would treat it as more than an inconvenient personnel complaint. What changed in the weeks after was smaller and quieter than a confrontation, but it mattered more in the long run. Marcus started keeping the drawing in his truck, taped to the visor above the driver's seat, so he'd see it every single time he started the engine, whether he was driving to the shop, or the diner, or anywhere at all. It became a kind of compass, not a reminder of guilt, though there was some of that woven through it, but a reminder of what all the hours were actually for. Roy Castellano, as it turned out, was not a man who could keep being careless with his staff forever without consequence, even if the consequence didn't come from Marcus directly. 3 weeks after the recital, the diner's owner, a woman named Patrice Okafor, who had built the place from a single counter and 4 stools, 22 years earlier and still dropped in unannounced, more often than her managers liked, came in on a random Tuesday afternoon and sat at the counter for nearly 2 hours just watching. She watched Roy snap at a server over a minor mistake with an order. She watched him take a personal phone call in the middle of the lunch rush while 2 tables sat with empty coffee cups. She watched Connie quietly cover for Marcus's section without being asked, the same way she'd quietly covered for him the night of the recital, because that was simply the culture Roy's carelessness had forced the good employees into building among themselves. Patrice didn't say much that day. She asked Connie on her way out how long Roy had been running the floor like that. Connie, who had nothing to lose and plenty she'd been holding on to, told her everything. She told her about the double shifts stacked onto people with families. She told her about the recital, about Roy's exact words regarding dance recitals not caring about the dinner rush, about the 4 minutes he refused to give a man who had never once called out, never once been late, never once given him a reason to be treated that way. Patrice asked for Marcus's number. She called him herself that evening while he was home making dinner for Lily, and she asked him plainly whether the story was true. Marcus told her it was, in the same flat, unembellished way he told anyone anything, without asking for sympathy and without softening it to protect Roy's feelings, because he'd learned there was no version of the truth that needed softening if the truth itself was simply what had happened. Patrice thanked him. She didn't promise anything on that call, and Marcus didn't expect her to. He'd learned not to expect follow-through from people above him in an organization, because follow-through had been rare his whole working life. But 10 days later, Roy Castellano was gone. Not fired loudly, not walked out by security in front of the staff, but simply absent one Monday morning, his name removed from the schedule board, replaced by a temporary manager, while Patrice conducted what she called a full review of scheduling practices across both of her locations. Marcus heard about it from Connie before he heard it from anyone official. He didn't celebrate. He wasn't a man who celebrated other people's downfalls, even ones that had cost him something real. He simply nodded, filed the information the way he filed everything, and went back to wiping down his section. What he didn't expect was for Patrice to ask to meet with him personally the following week in a back booth after close, with 2 cups of coffee and a folder of paperwork he hadn't asked for and didn't understand yet. She told him she'd reviewed 6 weeks of scheduling records after Connie's conversation with her. She told him what she found wasn't just one bad night. It was a pattern. Roy had been building shift assignments that punished employees who asked for anything at all, rewarding compliance and silence, and quietly pushing out anyone who had family obligations that conflicted with his convenience. She told him 3 other employees had similar stories, smaller in scale, but the same shape: a missed doctor's appointment, a missed anniversary, a missed parent-teacher conference that had caused someone a shift the following week as a kind of unspoken punishment for asking. Marcus listened without saying much. He wasn't there to build a case. He was there because she'd asked him to be, and he respected people enough to show up when they asked him something directly. Patrice slid the folder across the table. Inside was a new position. One she said she'd been considering creating for months, but had never found the right person for. She wanted someone to serve as a floor operations lead across both of her locations. Someone whose job would be, in part, to review scheduling fairness and make sure no manager was building shifts the way Roy had built his. She told him the pay would be better than either of his current 2 jobs combined. She told him the schedule would be his to help design, not just for himself, but as a template for how shifts got assigned company-wide going forward. Marcus read the offer once, sitting at that booth with the coffee going cold in front of him. He read it a second time, more slowly, the way he read anything that mattered, checking each clause the way he'd check a repair before signing off on it. Then he told Patrice he'd take it, on one condition. He said that, whatever the schedule looked like going forward for him and for anyone under him, no employee should ever be denied an hour off for their kid's recital, their kid's game, their kid's anything, if there was any reasonable way at all to make it work. He said, He understood the business had to run, and he wasn't asking for anything unreasonable, only for someone in the building to treat that kind of request like it mattered, instead of like it was an inconvenience to be punished. Patrice looked at him for a long moment before she answered. She told him that was exactly the reason she'd offered him the job in the first place. Marcus went home that night and told Lily about the new job. In simple terms, she could understand that he'd be working one job instead of two, and that it meant more nights he'd be home for dinner, more recitals he wouldn't miss, more ordinary Tuesdays where he'd just be there. Lily asked if that meant he could come to her next recital in the spring. Marcus told her he'd already asked for the date off, months in advance, the very same night he signed the new contract, because he wasn't going to let a red marker circle on a calendar mean nothing ever again. Lily didn't make a big production of it. She just nodded, satisfied, the way children are satisfied by promises that finally have some architecture behind them instead of just good intentions. That spring recital came, and Marcus sat in the third row, exactly where he'd promised to be the first time, and he watched his daughter dance in person, instead of on a 4-inch screen 6 hours late. She scanned the crowd once before the music started the same way she had before, and this time she found him immediately. And she smiled in a way that had nothing performative in it at all, just plain, simple relief and joy that he was there to see it. He didn't cry that night, not the way he had on his bedroom floor months earlier. This was a different kind of feeling, entirely quieter and steadier, the kind that comes from having fixed something that was broken rather than simply surviving something that hurt. After the recital, Lily ran to him in the lobby, still in her costume, and handed him a new piece of construction paper. Folded in half, he opened it right there among the other parents and dancers. It was another drawing, 2 stick figures again, but this time both figures were standing together in the third row of a stage, holding hands, no diner apron in sight. Above them, in the same uneven block letters, slightly steadier now that she'd had more practice with the crayons, it said simply, "Thank you for being here." Marcus folded the drawing carefully and put it in his jacket pocket, next to the wallet, where he kept the only 2 photographs he carried, one of Lily as a baby and one of her mother, who he didn't see much anymore, but who had given him this one extraordinary person to raise. He kept both drawings after that. The first one stayed taped to the visor of his truck for years, faded slightly from the sun, the crayon colors, softening but never disappearing entirely. The second one he framed and hung in the hallway of the house, right by the front door, so it was the first thing he saw every time he left for work, and the last thing he saw every time he came home. He never went back to working 2 jobs again, not because the new position made him wealthy, but because it made him present, and he'd learned, on the floor of his bedroom at 2 in the morning with a piece of construction paper in his hands. That presence was the only currency that had ever actually mattered to the person he was working for in the first place. Patrice, over the following year, used what she'd learned from Marcus's situation to rebuild her scheduling policy at both locations, posting it prominently in the break room where every employee could see it. It stated plainly that family obligations, medical needs, and children's milestones would be treated as legitimate scheduling priorities, not inconveniences to be managed around. Employees who had once dreaded the schedule board started checking it without the same knot in their stomach. Ando. Roy Castellano found work eventually at a different restaurant across town, where, as far as anyone knew, he ran his floor exactly the same way he always had, unaware or unwilling to notice that the reason his previous position no longer existed was written into the very policy his replacement had built, directly in response to how he'd once treated a quiet, hard-working, single father, with nowhere left to go but home. Marcus never spoke about Roy again after the transition was finished. He wasn't interested in relitigating something that was already settled. He'd gotten what mattered, which wasn't revenge. Because revenge had never been the thing he was after. It was simply a life reorganized around the 4 sentences a 7-year-old had written on a piece of construction paper in crayon, sentences that had cut through 16 hours of exhaustion and landed somewhere far deeper than guilt. Years later, when Lily was older, old enough to understand the whole shape of what had happened that autumn when she was 7, Marcus told her the story properly, start to finish, the missed recital, the drawing on the pillow, the job he eventually took because of what she'd written. Lily asked him if he still had the original drawing. He walked her to his truck and showed her the visor, where the construction paper still hung, sun-faded almost to the point of illegibility, the crayon lines soft as pencil now, but still readable, if you knew what you were looking for. Still holding the shape of two stick figures and four sentences that had once brought a grown man to the floor of his own bedroom in the middle of the night, Lily didn't say anything for a moment. She just reached out and touched the edge of the paper carefully, the way you'd touch something you understood, finally to be much more valuable than it had looked at the time. Then she told him she was glad she'd climbed onto his bed that night instead of just going to sleep. Sad, she said she remembered debating it, lying there, wondering if he'd even see it before morning, wondering if it would matter at all. Marcus told her it mattered more than anything else that had ever been left for him, anywhere, by anyone, and that was the truth of it, plain and unembellished, the way he told everything. Not a grand reversal of fortune, not a dramatic confrontation that fixed everything at once, but a slow, steady turning of the tide that started with a scared, tired man crying alone on his bedroom floor at 2 in the morning, holding a piece of paper covered in crayon, learning something he would carry with him for the rest of his life, that the people who love you don't measure you by the hours you missed. They measure you by the fact that you never stopped trying to be there, even when trying was the only thing you had left to give.